I think it is a duty incumbent on me to make this my last official communication. The citizens of America are now possessed of absolute freedom and independency. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation.
Let's explore The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, a groundbreaking book that rethinks American history from the perspectives of those often left out of traditional narratives. Rather than focusing on presidents, generals, and other figures of authority, Zinn centers on ordinary people, the workers, rebels, immigrants, and those who fought for justice and rights. Published in 1980, this book has challenged readers for decades to see history through new eyes, and its impact on how we understand the United States remains powerful and relevant. The power of perspective. Traditional American history books often focus on what we call the great men of history, the leaders, the conquerors, and the wealthy. Zinn's approach is different. He asks, what if we looked at the experiences of Native Americans, enslaved people, women, and immigrants to understand the true shape of history? What if, instead of celebrating Columbus for discovering America, we focused on the indigenous societies that already existed and the violence and suffering they endured as a result of colonization? By turning history on its head, Zinn invites us to question who benefits from the traditional telling of history and why certain events are remembered while others are forgotten. This isn't just about being critical, but about expanding our view of history to include the struggles and triumphs of ordinary people who resisted injustice and helped shape the nation. Colonialism and the founding of America. The story begins with Christopher Columbus. In traditional narratives, Columbus is often painted as a hero, but Zinn highlights the catastrophic impact of his arrival on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. According to Zinn, Columbus's expeditions led to brutal exploitation and the near eradication of native populations through violence, forced labor, and disease. This dark chapter sets the tone for how colonization was not simply about exploration, but about conquest and domination. When we get to the American colonies, Zinn again shifts the lens. Rather than viewing the Founding Fathers as purely heroic figures, Zinn explores how their ideals of liberty and equality often excluded large groups of people, particularly Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and lower-class white settlers. He doesn't dismiss the achievements of figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but he sheds light on their contradictions, like Jefferson's ownership of slaves despite his calls for equality. Zinn argues that the Revolution, while important, didn't bring freedom to everyone. It mainly secured the power of a new ruling class of wealthy, land-owning white men. The struggle for freedom. One of Zinn's key themes is the continuous struggle for freedom and equality, often led by those outside the circles of power. For example, while the U.S. Constitution is hailed as a beacon of democracy, Zinn points out that the document originally protected slavery and gave few rights to women or working-class people. It was the actions of these marginalized groups, fighting for their own rights, that slowly expanded the promise of democracy. Consider the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists, many of whom were former slaves or free black people, as well as white allies, risked everything to fight against the institution of slavery. Figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were crucial to this struggle, and their contributions pushed the nation toward the eventual abolition of slavery. The Civil War, in Zinn's view, wasn't just a battle between North and South, but a moment where enslaved people seized their own freedom, contributing to the Union war effort, and ultimately bringing down the institution of slavery from within. Labor movements and worker rights. Moving into the industrial era, Zinn focuses on the rise of labor movements as working-class people resisted exploitation by the wealthy elite. With the Industrial Revolution came vast wealth for a few, but poverty and hardship for the many. Workers faced grueling hours, unsafe conditions, and meager wages, leading to a wave of strikes and labor unions demanding fair treatment. One pivotal moment was the Pullman strike of 1894, where railroad workers protested wage cuts and poor conditions. The strike spread nationwide, eventually leading to a violent crackdown by federal troops. Events like this highlighted the lengths to which the government and big businesses would go to protect corporate interests. Zinn argues that the history of American industry is not just about progress and innovation, but about the struggle of workers to win basic rights against powerful corporations.
The labor movement started around the Industrial Revolution, a time in the late 19th century when America exploded in size and wealth. Advances in technology created manufacturing jobs, and people moved to cities to work in factories. But it wasn't the workers getting rich. It was their bosses who raked in big profits by paying low wages for long hours.
Women's rights and the fight for equality Zinn also delves deeply into the history of women's rights, showing how women too have fought for recognition and equality in a society that often marginalized and overlooked them. He traces this fight back to the early days of the United States, when women had few legal rights, limited access to education, and almost no say in public affairs. The fight for women's rights has been a constant struggle for both legal recognition and cultural acceptance, as women pushed back against rigid gender norms that kept them confined to specific roles in family and society. The suffrage movement was a pivotal part of this struggle. Figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth fought for decades to secure women's right to vote.
From the time of the American Revolution through 1920, women fought to attain the same social, political, and economic status in the United States as men. In 1920, women in the United States won the right to vote by virtue of the passage of the 19th Amendment. But the struggle to attain that right was a long one, fraught with violence, political turmoil, and social upheaval.
Believing that political equality was essential for securing broader social and economic rights. This movement involved protests, conventions, petitions, and even arrests, as women's rights activists pushed back against societal norms and political systems that denied them a voice. Their efforts eventually led to the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote. But as Zinn emphasizes, the fight didn't end there. Beyond suffrage, Zinn explores how the feminist movement continued to evolve and grow, especially during the 20th century. The women's rights movement diversified, expanding its goals to address economic and social inequalities that were still deeply entrenched. Women sought equal opportunities in education and the workplace, demanded equal pay, and worked to eliminate discriminatory laws and practices. During the 1960s and 1970s, the second wave of feminism emerged, with activists like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan advocating for reproductive rights, workplace equality, and the dismantling of oppressive gender roles. The movement addressed issues ranging from access to birth control to the need for affordable childcare, pushing for systemic changes that would allow women to live independently and equally. Zinn's focus on the feminist movement highlights the intersectionality of the struggle for equality. Women from diverse backgrounds, working-class women, Black women, Latina women, and LGBTQ women, often faced multiple layers of discrimination. These women not only had to fight for gender equality, but also for racial, economic, and social justice, as many were marginalized not only by gender, but also by race, class, or sexual orientation. Zinn emphasizes that the mainstream feminist movement sometimes overlooked the unique struggles faced by these women, and he acknowledges the contributions of women from all backgrounds who fought tirelessly to bring attention to these issues. Figures like Angela Davis and Audre Lorde, for example, challenged traditional feminism to recognize the specific experiences of women of color and working-class women. In Zinn's view, the women's rights movement exemplifies how ordinary people have shaped the nation through collective action. These weren't simply battles for legal rights, but deeper fights for social and cultural change. Women had to challenge deep-seated gender roles and biases that limited them, not only in terms of legal rights, but also in the cultural narrative that defined their roles as wives, mothers, and caregivers. The movement for women's rights has been about rewriting that narrative, about creating a society where women can define their own roles, ambitions, and identities. Zinn's examination of the women's rights movement doesn't stop in the past. He also highlights the ongoing challenges that women face today. Issues like workplace discrimination, gender-based violence, reproductive rights, and pay inequity continue to be part of the feminist agenda. The civil rights movement. One of the most compelling sections of the people's history of the United States covers the Civil Rights Movement. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks are well known, but Zinn also shines a light on the countless, often nameless activists who work tirelessly at the grassroots level to challenge segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. Zinn describes how the Civil Rights Movement's achievements were the result of years of struggle, sacrifice, and risk. Sit-ins, boycotts, marches, and legal battles all contributed to landmark changes like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Yet Zinn emphasizes that these victories didn't solve everything. Systemic racism and inequality remain challenges in American society. The Civil Rights Movement, like many other movements in Zinn's history, shows how change is often a slow, collective process driven by those at the grassroots. Conclusion: a people's legacy. Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States challenges us to see American history in a new way. It's a story not just of presidents and generals, but of resistance and resilience by ordinary people. This history is alive with the voices of those who fought for freedom, equality, and justice, often against overwhelming odds. Zinn's work reminds us that history is not fixed. The struggles of the past echo in the present, urging us to reflect on the kind of society we want to build. As we look to the future, the People's History of the United States asks us to remember that real progress is achieved not only by those at the top, but by the countless, often unsung individuals who work for change from the bottom up. This is the legacy of a people's history, a continuous journey toward justice, written by all of us.